Hey everyone, my name is Rebecca Deck, and today I want to talk a little bit about Avalara's secure development practices and some of the things that you as engineers who are consuming our products might want to be cognizant of as far as how to connect and what some of the norms are that we follow at Avalara. Hopefully this will help people avoid some kinds of compatibility issues and problems down the line with systems integrations that you develop. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about why security is important and why we're even doing this, because that's often a topic that I get asked, right? Why are you shoving this down our throats? So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about some of the controls that we have within our software development lifecycle at Avalara that I think are of value for anybody who is developing software. And we'll talk about a couple of things that have historically been problematic at organizations or that have surprised engineers that I want to kind of call out so that you know what to expect and you kind of know where our heads are at as security engineers at Avalara. So my name is Rebecca Deck. I am a principal application security engineer at Avalara. So I'm in the product security part of the organization, reporting up to the CTO. I am very much an engineer, not really a compliance person, although I do work closely with folks in compliance in these other parts of the organization. Previous to this, I was a security consultant doing application penetration testing, so looking for vulnerabilities in people's software. I was also a software engineer for about 8 years, so I have a little bit of professional respect for other software developers, try to have some empathy in everything that we do. And I also worked as a QA tester at earlier points in my career. I've done things like incident response, that kind of thing. And I was also completely unrelated to tech in the military for 4 years. I'm based in the Cary, North Carolina area. So I'm a little bit south of our Durham office at Avalara. I have a lot of security certifications. And as I've gone through that process, I learned a lot about what to think is important and how to spend time and how to work with engineers as people. So I try to let that kind of thing shine through in everything that I do. I love to eat sugar and I have standing Tuesday ice cream dates. I do a lot of baking, I make costumes, I watch anime, and I read a lot of books. So the first thing that I want to do to try to level set things, right? Security is just another component of quality software. It's not possible to have a piece of software that is quality and also is insecure. So we very much fall in line with engineering practices. I am against the idea that security is some kind of like dark magic that only arcane folks know how to do. I think as long as we are following good engineering practices, the security just will come naturally. So that's kind of how we have modeled our SDLC and everything like that. So why are we spending time doing this? First off, it's really the right thing to do. I've had my information stolen, it stinks, and I'm still a pretty privileged person. And it can be really bad for some people or some companies if their data are lost due to a breach. So we try to be respectful of everybody and realize that these are real things with real consequences for people. Also, from a more businessy perspective, right? This helps enable sales. That's one of the things that security does. More mature customers want this. This is a feature that customers demand. Also, sometimes if you want to move into new business verticals, you're going to have to follow certain regulations. If you want to be handling certain types of data in the European Union, there are things that you really need to do, or you will be paying large penalties. And then also from the sales enablement perspective, certain customers want you to have certain certifications for your applications. And then finally, one thing that we learned is that we can really improve the overall engineering maturity at Avalara by using our security and integrating with good development practices. So we are responsible for pushing a lot of things like infrastructure as code, and these are kind of in coordination with our architecture teams and our reliability engineering teams at Avalara to make sure we're all moving in the same direction. Right. And so these are things where very much the rising tide can lift all boats and make things just much easier to do. Same thing with containerization, right? We try to make sure that when we are coming up with security controls, we are thinking of how to push people to be able to develop software quicker and more securely and more reliably, all at the same time. So all these things kind of work together. In security, it's also very difficult to do things like respond to incidents if you don't have documentation about what a system looks like and what the pieces are. It's difficult for me to tell you if a system is designed in a secure way if I don't know how it's designed. So we put a lot of emphasis on documentation, right? And that's something that, again, it helps reliability engineering, it helps security, and it helps architecture. Everybody kind of working together on these. And then I mentioned that customers really do care about this. So one of the ways in which customers care about this is through these vendor security questionnaires. So there are vendor security departments. Avalara has one as well. Whenever we go to do business with a third party, they get a questionnaire, right? And it's not really possible for me to influence what the questions are, right? I'm not going to argue with a customer and tell them that a question isn't good and valid. I am just going to do my best to answer those questions. And sometimes customers say, if you don't do X, we will not work with you, right? And depending on business constraints, that may be enough to have Avalara start changing the way that we do things. If we get enough customers asking for a specific feature, security feature in our applications, that is going to be something that does get prioritized, right? So a lot of customers do want answers to these questionnaires, and they can be used to force change, right? And I may personally have different sets of priorities, things that I would rather have engineers work on. But if a customer is demanding a feature, we kind of have a duty to create that feature for that customer. So, and a lot of these vendor security offices do rely very heavily on public scan data. So they don't have the benefit of knowing what's going on in Avalara's internal network. So maybe to me, I would much rather prioritize some internal configuration issues. But because they are accessible, right, the only thing that they can legally look at are public-facing sites. And even then, they can't do full scans of all of our websites. That would be illegal. What they can do is look at security response headers, encryption protocols, these things that are going to be public knowledge. They will look at that and then draw conclusions based on those about how well you do security. They don't necessarily delineate based on product. They look at it and they see Avalara. If we do an acquisition and that acquisition hasn't previously followed all of the requirements for whomever this third party is, Avalara now owns that, and then we are responsible for bringing them up to compliance. And even though that may not have anything to do with AvaTax, right, it still reflects on Avalara as a company. So we do our best to aggressively control our perimeter and make sure that sites aren't being misattributed to us and that kind of thing. But otherwise, that can affect priority. So sometimes I'll have conversations where someone says, Rebecca, why do you care about this HTTP response header? It's not that big of a deal, or it shouldn't apply here. Fantastic, I agree, right? But I can't necessarily go make that argument to a customer or to these third parties. So that happened a lot with TLS, right? Where someone said, well, why is this really that important? Because we had to, right? It's kind of our duty to a customer to do that. So some of our SDLC controls that I did want to cover, all of our software goes through a lot of security testing. We have mandatory training for all of our engineers. I care very deeply about training, and I want to make sure that I'm having the most productive conversations with my engineers as possible. So I'll have conversations about prioritization and how to remediate certain vulnerabilities, because nothing makes me sadder than an engineer working to fix a problem and then finding out that they fixed it wrong, right? So we try to level set that stuff very early on with Avalara. And then we have these things that most companies do that I think are certainly of value and should be included in your SDLCs. So things like code review to make sure nobody's putting in backdoors or accidentally writing bugs into software. Software composition analysis, so making sure that open source components that we do rely on, that everybody relies on, don't have known vulnerabilities in them. We also do static application security testing for applications when they're not running, and dynamic application security testing for running applications. We do application penetration testing and certainly responsible disclosure. And this doesn't include any of our host or network-based protections that we do because they're kind of outside of the SDLC. But just some things that might be helpful to you. Most of the time, engineers who are third parties that deal with us never see this, right? These are our engineering practices that fix bugs, hopefully before you ever see that piece of software. All right, and now I'm going to move into a couple of specific control types. So these are things that in my career, I have noticed caused integration-related problems and confusion. So I just want to talk through these so that you understand where we're coming from, why we're doing them, and kind of how you should be looking at these specific topics. And the first one is transport layer encryption. So this is something Avalara did run a project to upgrade our transport layer encryption in the last year. And this is one of those things where people ask me, Rebecca, why did you prioritize this kind of security control? And there are not a lot of known ways to exploit somebody using a triple DES cipher suite. Not en masse. There's not a lot of breaches that occur because of a weak cipher suite or weak protocol. But it's still something that we have to do. It's a very easily observable thing that reflects poorly on the security practice as a whole. And it's necessary for compatibility. It's kind of like both of us have to be speaking the same language at all times. So we have to do it with our third parties that we integrate with. And it's kind of expected that if you're integrating with our systems, this is just kind of the thing that has to be done. Everybody has to do it. And a lot of like payment card industry and these other types of industries have created standards, and they've really forced all companies to fall in line with this. So it's just something that you have to do. Now, we try to do it as infrequently as possible because we do realize that it is very disruptive. Right? So when it is time, when these third parties start saying, hey, look, this cipher suite is no longer secure, that is when we will be pushing to perform these kinds of updates. We don't have any immediate plans for further updates on protocols and cipher suites regarding TLS. But don't forget the lessons that everybody had to learn when doing TLS, the upgrade that we recently did to use TLS 1.2 and deprecate versions 1.1 and 1.0 of TLS. And obviously SSL v3 that's long since gone. Because these are going to come up again every few years. People are going to have to redesign these integrations and make sure that their cipher suites are up to date. Regarding certificates, we've had some customers who have certificate problems when we rotate our site certificates. That's something that we have to do, right? Certificates are only valid for a certain period of time, and they aren't valid long enough for us to do a whole big year-long project every time a certificate is going to expire, because that's just going to happen all the time. It's also theoretically possible that certificates are compromised, and then we will be forced to perform this kind of rotation in a very ad hoc and emergency way if that occurs. Do not pin certificates. So that's the practice of looking for a specific piece of information and then on a certificate, and then requiring that that piece of information doesn't change. That's a very dangerous practice to do if you don't have very mature integrations, and that's not a service that we are providing at this time. So don't pin the certificates, prepare for us to rotate them. Some languages, especially Java, have their own certificate store that doesn't get updated. Normally, that kind of thing gets done when you patch your operating system. Java is not that way. Java has its own set of certificate authorities. So when we ask for a new certificate for an avalara.io domain, we will get a new certificate. We don't necessarily control what the intermediate certificate authority is on that certificate. So as long as we're using publicly trusted certificates, not something that we internally generate, at least not for our public sites. As long as you are keeping your certificate stores up to date with the latest certificate authorities, that shouldn't be an issue. But it will be a problem if that's not a practice that you just do as part of your normal system maintenance, just like patching your operating system. Then also HTTP strict transport security. So this just enforces everyone to use encrypted connections. Make sure you're always just using encrypted connections to connect to our systems. All of our systems offer HTTPS protocols. If you connect to HTTP, it will be open, but it will redirect you to the HTTPS version of the site. And that's going to eat up precious milliseconds when you're asking for somebody to conduct a tax calculation, right? You don't want to be wasting any time to make sure that you're providing the best service you can to your customers. We don't have any current plans to HSTS preloading at this time either. The content security policy. So content security policy just controls a web browser will look at it and say, should I be rendering this content type or should I not? The main place that we think about this is in JavaScript, but it also has to do with framing and images and this kind of these other parts as well. But JavaScript is the main one because it is a control for cross-site scripting. So these third parties do care an awful lot about not having inline JavaScript. So that causes us to modify some of our frameworks that mandate the use of inline JavaScript or libraries that we use that might rely on inline JavaScript. Now, something that we will be changing that should not necessarily affect you, right, is because your sites should manage your own CSP policies. Now, if you do have like a widget or something that we provide, then we have to make sure that we are not using inline JavaScript in order for you to set appropriate CSPs on your pages. But that is definitely something that we are looking at this year. Framing, that's not a big deal unless you're developing a UI around a user interface that we already provide. So if you want to frame one of our websites in an iframe, hopefully that is one that we planned on you doing that for. Otherwise, a CSP could break that. So make sure that you are checking as you coordinate when you develop a UI for any of our systems, and this will show up in a couple places today. And our APIs, right, since they don't run JavaScript, they don't load content from other places, they can have very restrictive CSP headers. And that is kind of our intention, to put restrictive CSP headers on all of our APIs. Next is CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. So this is kind of a API type of control, a control that applies to APIs that prevents cross-site request forgery. So it's the type of attack where an attacker will make a user interface or script that forces a victim to make requests to one of Avalara's APIs. And it usually, CORS comes into play when you're making XML HTTP requests, XHRs, to our APIs. Now, the old way that you would fix cross-site request forgery or CSRF is by including nonces, but that doesn't really work very well when you decouple APIs from UIs. So that's why CORS is really helpful in that regard. Browsers will send these kind of pre-flight requests to the API, and then the API says, yes, that is an okay request, or no, it's not, and then the browser will or will not perform that. It shouldn't apply if you are doing computer-to-computer non-browser related communication with the Avalara APIs. You should be just fine unless your framework does send these kind of pre-flight requests, and not all of them do. But this is, again, where it's really important that it is a system that we are providing that is designed for you to integrate with it. It's designed for you to create a UI. It's not, it's kind of building on really shaky ground if we don't intend for you to be building UIs for one of our APIs and then you attempt to do so. So make sure you coordinate before embarking on that kind of development practice. And next, cross-site scripting. So with cross-site scripting, this is where you force a victim browser to run JavaScript. Now, every site that has a UI is going to be the control point for this, right? This doesn't really apply if a content type response header is set to application/JSON, which is the case for most APIs that Avalara provides, almost all of them. And there are a couple of ways that I've heard people say that you remediate cross-site scripting. A popular one people like to suggest is input sanitization, but we don't really believe in that Because input sanitization is security forcing engineering to make determinations about what content should or shouldn't look like. And that's not a great position to be in as a security team, saying, oh, well, you should never have a pointy bracket. It's like saying you should never have a single quote or double quotes in text. That's not a really safe thing to say. We wouldn't want to say that you can't have a single quote in a business name. That's not fair. They occur in people's names all the time. So that's why we don't really rely on input sanitization. So that means that output encoding is the correct way to deal with it. Now, the thing about output encoding is in order to prevent cross-site scripting, it's different based on how you're using that data. So if you're rendering it as part of HTML, you need to HTML encode it. If you are putting it into JavaScript, you need to JavaScript hex code escape it. So as an API developer, I can't really tell you what the correct way to encode it is because it depends on the user interface. And we'll certainly do it on our user interfaces. But if you're developing a user interface for our system, then that is something that you will have to be responsible for. Our APIs will not do it for you. And there's a great example of where I've seen this kind of thing go awry. I was watching The Handmaid's Tale on Hulu using my Roku. And when it came across and displayed on the Roku app, the API developer had HTML encoded that content before sending it to the application. So when it showed up in the Hulu app, it came across as the handmaid ampersand APOS semicolon space tail. Right? That's not the appropriate presentation. And that's exactly what will happen if we do output encoding on the API level. So that's something that we really try to make sure engineers at Avalara are not doing. And occasionally it does come up where we do third-party assessments and they say, oh, you should be doing HTML encoding here. And I will argue with security engineers all day long about that. So in the end, we view quality software as being secure software. We are just another component of quality. So I think that it works best to create a non-adversarial relationship between security and engineering when we all get on the same page with that. Next, make sure that your systems are able to adapt. Our systems have to change, especially with encryption. We don't have a choice, right? You can't argue with me and say, oh, Rebecca, we shouldn't be doing this. It's out of my hands. So design your systems appropriately. Our sites will start having much more restrictive content security policies, and that's a good practice for your sites as well. It's valuable from a security perspective, and it's something that's very easy to observe without authentication or anything like that by third parties who are recommending you to customers or not recommending you to customers based on your security posture. And then if you're designing UIs, make sure that we intend for you to be designing a UI against that system. Otherwise, you will run into problems with cores, you'll run into problems handling output encoding, that kind of thing. If you're relying on us to do that, that is not something that we're going to be doing. All right, so now we'd love to field any questions. If you do have them, please use the chat in the meeting and we'll get to those questions. Thank you.